Montana Territory, 1882. The wind howled across the plains as the stagecoach wheels groaned to a stop in the muddy street of Dry Creek, and Margaret Zeller stepped down into a town that had already decided her fate. Her gloved hand trembled as she adjusted her bonnet. She had braided her hair neatly, her dress pressed despite the long journey. But none of that would matter now. Not when the thing that defined her to others was the scar that ran from her left temple to just below her cheekbone, a jagged mark from a fire that had taken her first husband and nearly her life. Children stared. Women whispered. And as she turned to face the man she had written for months, Mr. Calvin Harris, a widowed merchant with 2 young boys, she saw it. The expression, the recoil. He stepped forward, then paused. "You did not mention that," he said, waving vaguely at her face. "I did not hide it either," Margaret replied, her voice low but steady. "I cannot bring that into my home," he said. "My boys, they lost a mother," she said. "And I have lost more than you can measure." But he shook his head and turned away. Just like that, the stagecoach driver cleared his throat. "Miss, what do you want me to do with your trunk?" She could not answer. Her hands were numb. Margaret stood alone on the wooden walkway, the town moving on around her. Her heart pounded, but her face did not betray it. She had learned long ago there was no safety in letting people see your pain. Across the street, a man stepped out of the livery stable, wiping his hands on a rag. He was tall and lean, with sun-browned skin and steady eyes. He watched the scene without blinking. He crossed over without hurry, boots striking the boards with quiet thuds. "Ma'am," he said, nodding once. "Do you need help?" Margaret's eyes met his. "No," she whispered, though she clearly did. He looked down at the trunk, then back at her. "Name's Thaddeus Finch. I have a ranch about 6 miles west, near the Bitterroot. You are welcome to wait there until you figure your next step. I do not need charity." "It is not charity," he said simply. "It is an offer. I do not like seeing decent people left out in the cold." Margaret looked past him at the empty street. The stagecoach was already pulling away. "All right," she said. He lifted the trunk like it weighed nothing and loaded it into his wagon. She climbed up beside him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "You were here to marry that merchant," Thaddeus said after a few miles of silence. "Yes. I saw how he looked at you. A man like that does not deserve a woman like you." She blinked. "You do not even know me." "I know enough," he said, eyes on the trail ahead. "You came all the way here with hope in your chest. That takes grit." Margaret did not answer, but her jaw loosened just a little. The ranch sat low in a valley, ringed with pine and cottonwood. A creek whispered through the back fields. There were horses in the corral and smoke curling from the chimney. A woman came out as they arrived, older, gray-haired, kind-eyed. "This is my Aunt Helen," Thaddeus said. "She helps me keep the place going." Helen stepped forward and took Margaret's hands. "You are welcome here, dear." That night, Margaret ate stew by the fire while Thaddeus sat across from her, listening more than he spoke. He did not ask about her scar. He did not flinch. After dinner, Helen showed her to a small room with a plain bed and patchwork quilt. Margaret stood by the window a long time before undressing. She touched the scar lightly in the mirror. The skin was raised and pale, but no longer raw. She was not raw either, just tired. The next morning, she rose early and helped Helen gather eggs. By afternoon, she had rolled her sleeves and joined Thaddeus in the pastures, helping with the fencing. She worked without complaint. "You ever been on a ranch before?" he asked, handing her a hammer. "No," she said, "but I learned fast." He smiled faintly. "That I believe." Days passed. Margaret grew used to the rhythm, the early mornings, the steady work, the quiet evenings. She started to laugh again, quietly at first, then clearer. She felt her shoulders loosen. One afternoon, she found Thaddeus fixing a broken step on the porch. She handed him the nails without being asked. "I should leave soon," she said. He looked up. "I cannot stay here forever." He set the hammer down. "You can stay as long as you like. I did not come here to take advantage of kindness. And I did not offer it lightly." She hesitated. "You do not look at me the way others do. I see a woman who has lived through fire. That does not make her less. Makes her more." Her eyes filled, but she blinked them clear. "You are a strange man, Mr. Finch." "Maybe," he said, "but I know what matters." Another week passed. One evening as the sun dipped low, painting the fields in gold, Margaret stood at the fence and watched the horses graze. Thaddeus joined her, his shoulder brushing hers. "You ever think about trying again?" he asked, voice quiet. She turned to him. "Trying what?" "Marriage. A life." "I did," she said. "Until someone decided I was not enough." "You are enough," he said. "More than enough." She looked up at him, her breath catching. "I will not ask unless I mean it," he said. "And I mean it, Margaret. If you will have me, I will be proud to call you my wife." She studied his face. There was no pity in him, no hesitation, just truth. "I will," she said. He reached for her hand, and she let him take it. And for the first time in a long time, Margaret Zeller felt like she belonged. Late spring softened the land around Thaddeus's ranch. The snowmelt had thickened the grasses in the lower field, and a pair of sandhill cranes took to nesting near the creek, their calls echoing through the dusk. Margaret rose early now without needing to be called, her hands steady with the milking, her back strong from hauling feed. She wore her scars like she wore her apron, part of daily life, not something to be remarked on. When she came inside one morning with dirt beneath her fingernails and a pale brown egg warm in her palm, Helen left the bread dough and said, "You've folded yourself into this place like you were made for it." Margaret set the egg in the basket gently. "I didn't think I'd feel that way again." Helen nodded but didn't press. She never did. She had the patience of someone who'd outlived many things. That afternoon, the valley filled with the sound of saws and hammering. Thaddeus was adding a lean-to along the north side of the barn, and Margaret brought water and held beams as he notched and fitted joints. He worked with quiet focus, sleeves rolled, sawdust clinging to his arms. "You build like someone who doesn't want to do it twice," she said. "I don't mind getting it right the first time." She smiled but didn't answer. The sun moved slow and golden across the ridge, and they worked without needing to speak more. When they came in that evening, Helen had gone to visit a neighbor who'd taken sick. Margaret ladled broth from the pot and set it on the table. They ate by lamplight, breeze lifting the curtains. A coyote barked far off, and Thaddeus leaned back in his chair. "I was 23 when I bought this land," he said. "Didn't know a damn thing about cattle. Just had the deed, 2 mules, and an axe." "You built all this alone?" "Had help when I could afford it. Rest I did slow." "I don't mind slow." She folded her hands in her lap. "My father was a cooper. He always said a barrel done slow never leaked. Smart man. He died in the fever when I was 20. My husband not long after." Thaddeus didn't offer sympathy, just met her gaze and said, "Hard to lose the ones who knew you before." Her throat tightened. "Yes." They sat quiet after that, the wind shifting through the eaves. When she rose to clear the dishes, he stood too. As they washed side by side, he said, "There's a church gathering in town next Sunday. Not much more than a sermon and pie, but the preacher's decent and the music's not bad." She rinsed a plate and handed it to him. "You asking me to go?" "I am." She dried her hands on a cloth. "Then I'll say yes." The week passed with work and soft weather. On Sunday, Margaret wore a dress Helen had taken in for her, sage-colored with a plain hem. They rode to town in the wagon, the road muddy in places, the trees budding green along the hillsides. Dry Creek hadn't changed. Same crooked sign above the dry goods store, same smoke rising from the blacksmith's forge. But Margaret felt different walking beside Thaddeus. The way people looked at them didn't touch her anymore. Inside the church house, the benches were packed and the preacher spoke on mercy. Afterward, women passed around pie and lemonade, and children chased each other in the grass. Thaddeus stood with 2 other ranchers, talking cattle prices, but his eyes kept finding her in the crowd. She was speaking with a schoolmistress when she felt a hand at the small of her back. "All right?" he asked. "Yes. I haven't seen you smile like that before." She looked up at him. "You've been watching?" "Only when you're not looking." She didn't answer, but her cheeks warmed. On the ride home, he handed her a wrapped cloth. Stopped by the mercantile while you were outside. Saw this and thought of you. She unfolded its spools of thread, a new pair of scissors, and a small tin of salve. Not the kind for beauty, but the kind for healing. Her voice caught. You remembered I said I used to mend things. You make things whole. She reached across the seat and took his hand. That night, they didn't speak much. But when he touched her cheek before she went to bed, he didn't look away from the scar. He touched it like it mattered. Like it was part of the story he wanted to learn with her. And for the first time since the fire, she slept through the night without waking. By early June, the ryegrass reached Margaret's knees, and the calves had grown bold enough to chase one another along the fence lines. The ranch moved with a steady pulse, fences mended, water troughs checked, tack repaired in long stretches of quiet work. Margaret kept pace with Thaddeus without complaint, her shoulders sun-browned, her hands rougher now, though she still moved with a certain carefulness, as though something inside her had been stitched too tight for too long. One evening, after supper had cooled and Helen had taken her knitting to the porch, Thaddeus pulled a small tin box from the high shelf behind the hearth. He set it on the table and sat down across from Margaret, who was folding a length of muslin into strips for new pillowcases. I've been meaning to show you something, he said as he opened the box. Inside it were thin, worn envelopes, each one addressed in a different hand, some yellowed at the edges, one tied with a faded green ribbon. These are letters from my brother, he said. He fought under General Crook during the war. Stayed out west after. Took to trading with the Bannock near Fort Hall. Then vanished somewhere near Snake River. Last I heard from him was 7 years ago. Margaret touched the edge of a folded page. You kept them all. He was the only family I had left. I tried going after him once. Got as far as Salmon City before the trail ran cold. Her eyes met his. You carry it. Every day, he said. Sometimes I think if I'd gone sooner, I might have found him. She didn't offer comfort. Instead, she asked, why tell me this now? Because I trust you with it, he said. And because I want you to know the shape of the man you're marrying. Margaret's hand stilled on the muslin. You've not spoken of it like that before, as settled fact. I've been thinking on what it means to ask, not just in passing but proper. You deserve more than a quiet assumption. She nodded once. Then ask me. He leaned forward, his voice low. Margaret Zeller, will you marry me? Here on this land, under that grove where the cottonwoods bend west? Her lips parted, but no answer came. Then, in a voice steady with something deeper than surprise, she said yes. He reached across and took her hand, warm and calloused. I'll ask Helen to write to the circuit preacher. He makes the rounds every fortnight. Margaret folded the muslin and set it aside. I'll mend my blue dress. It's stronger in the seams than the sage one. That night, she sat by the fire and reread the letter from her sister in Ohio, the one she carried in her keepsake box. It was dated 2 winters ago, full of kind words but distant ones. Her sister had remarried, moved to Cincinnati. There was no invitation to visit, no mention of Margaret's loss. Just news of births and sewing circles. She folded the letter and tucked it away. Then she reached for the tin Thaddeus had left out, and read through one of the letters from his brother, tracing the words like she was learning the sound of another grief. There was strength in knowing each other's wounds. The following days moved with quiet purpose. Margaret helped Helen prepare for the preacher's visit, airing the quilts, setting aside flour and lard for biscuits. Thaddeus cleared the grove behind the barn where the cottonwoods sloped down toward the creek. He built a bench from pine boards and drove 2 upright posts into the earth, stringing a line between them for a cloth canopy. The morning of the wedding, Helen plaited Margaret's hair and pinned it with a comb carved from antler, one she said had belonged to her mother. It's not lace and ribbons, she said, but it holds. I'd rather have something that holds, Margaret said. The preacher arrived by horseback, dust on his collar and a leather-bound Bible tucked beneath one arm. Thaddeus wore a clean linen shirt, the sleeves creased, his boots polished with beeswax. Margaret stood beside him in the blue dress, the hem just brushing her boots, her hands steady in his. The vows were spoken beneath the trees. The air smelled of warm earth and wild mint. When Thaddeus placed the simple gold band on her finger, he didn't look at her scar. He looked at her eyes. Helen served coffee and molasses cake afterward. The preacher stayed for one plate, then tipped his hat and rode on. That night, as the candle in their bedroom guttered low, Margaret stood by the window looking out over the pasture. The moon edged the hills, and a low fog clung to the lower slope. She felt Thaddeus's presence behind her, quiet but near. "You don't have to say anything," he said. She turned to him. "I want to. I just don't always know how, not in words." "You don't need to. You show it." She touched his chest above the heart. "You've given me a place I never thought I'd have again." He rested his hand over hers. "You've made it more than it was." They lay beside each other that night without urgency. Their hands tangled, breath matched. In the stillness, neither tried to fill the silence, because it was not empty. It was full of everything they hadn't said, and everything they didn't need to. Outside, the wind shifted through the cottonwoods. And inside, Margaret Zeller Finch slept with her hand in her husband's, her body at peace, her heart no longer waiting. By late July, the creek ran low and clear, and the air hung thick with the scent of sage and warm pine. Margaret moved through the days with a quiet steadiness, her place in the household no longer tentative, but rooted. She had begun planting herbs along the kitchen wall: yarrow, horehound, and comfrey, each one chosen with care. She didn't speak of it, but Helen noticed the way she pinched the stems and checked the soil twice a day. It was the kind of attention given by someone building something meant to last. That morning, Thaddeus rode out before first light to help a neighbor drive a bull back up from the canyon flats. He hadn't said when he'd return. Margaret churned butter in the cool of the cellar, her sleeves rolled and hair braided tight against her neck. When she came up, Helen was setting out a sheet to dry over the line, her fingers stiff from the morning chill. "Got a letter," Helen said, nodding toward the table. The envelope was creased and dusty at the edges. Margaret wiped her hands before lifting it. The handwriting was unfamiliar, tight, slanted, and masculine. She opened it slowly, scanning the lines once, then again. "It's from the sheriff in Fort Benton," she said after a long pause. "A man came into their jail last month using the name Calvin Harris." Helen turned, startled. "The merchant." Margaret folded the letter neatly. "He'd been arrested for swindling several women. Promised marriage, took their dowry money, then vanished. The sheriff said he's been living under different names across the territory." Helen frowned. "You were lucky." Margaret looked toward the window. "I wouldn't call it luck, but I came through." She tucked the letter into a drawer and didn't mention it again. That evening, Thaddeus returned with dust on his hat and a cut just above his wrist. Margaret cleaned it in silence, her fingers quick and sure. He watched her for a moment, then said, "You look like you've been thinking." "I got a letter." "Bad news?" "No, just a reminder." She wrapped the linen snug around his arm. "The man who turned me away in Dry Creek wasn't the end of the road. He was just a wrong turn." Thaddeus didn't ask more. Instead, he reached for her hand. "You still want to come with me to the fair next week?" She nodded. "I've never been to one. There'll be harness races, music, some fool trying to ride a bear." "I'll keep you away from that part." She smiled. "I'd like to see what passes for music in these parts." He leaned back. "You'll hear better than you expect. The Dawson girl plays fiddle like she was born with rosin in her blood." They sat outside after supper, watching the bats flit across the sky. The moon was half full and the stars pressed close overhead. Thaddeus leaned his chair against the wall, arms crossed over his chest. "Do you miss the East?" he asked. "I miss the river. The sound of it. And the smell of bread baking in the alley behind our shop." She paused. "But there's nothing back there waiting for me anymore. Here there's breath." He didn't speak, but he reached over and rested a hand on her knee. She let it stay there. By the time the fair came, the days were hot enough that the horses sweated just standing. They hitched the wagon early and made the ride in silence, save for Margaret humming under her breath. She wore a dress she'd let Helen dye with black walnut, plain but well-fitted. Thaddeus wore his Sunday shirt, though he left the collar unbuttoned in the heat. The fairground was a patch of open field near the river bend, with canvas tents flapping and dust rising around the booths. Children ran with sticks, and a trio of fiddlers played quick-time reels by the rail fence. Margaret stood still for a moment, taking it in. "Been a while since I saw this many people," she said. "You want to walk or sit?" "Walk." They moved slowly through the crowd, stopping at stalls where women sold hand-pieced quilts and men hawked soap and tin toys. Margaret lingered near a booth of carved spoons and bowls. She picked one up, tracing the grain with her thumb. Thaddeus paid the vendor without a word and handed it to her. "For your herbs." She held it for a long moment before tucking it into her basket. They watched the harness race from the shade of a cottonwood. Margaret leaned into his side, her head just beneath his shoulder. "You ever think about having children?" she asked, voice low. He didn't answer right away. "I used to," he said, "but I figured that door had closed." "Maybe it hasn't," she said. His fingers tightened around hers. "Not if it's with you." They stayed until dusk, until the lanterns were lit and the music turned slower, sweeter. Margaret didn't dance, but she watched the couples with a soft look in her eye, and when Thaddeus offered his arm, she took it. They didn't speak on the ride home. The moon was brighter now, and the road empty. She rested her head against his arm, and he drove with one hand on the reins, the other covering hers in her lap. When they reached the ranch, she didn't go straight inside. Instead, she walked along the fence, the spoon in her hand. She stood there a while, breathing the night in. Thaddeus came up behind her. "I didn't expect this," she said. He waited. "I didn't expect to feel, not just safe, but known." He touched her back lightly. "You are." "Then I'll stay," she said. "Not because I have nowhere else, but because this is where I want to be." He didn't try to answer. He just kissed her hair, and they stood there as the stars turned slowly above them, steady and sure. August leaned long and golden across the valley with the air full of heat that clung to skin and slowed the work. The rye had been cut and stacked in neat shocks, and the chickens spent their afternoons beneath the porch, wings lifted to cool their bellies. Margaret stood at the table with a jar of vinegar in one hand and dill clippings in the other, her sleeves damp from washing cucumbers in the basin. The pickling would take all afternoon, but she welcomed the stillness of the kitchen while Thaddeus worked with the farrier out at the south fence. Helen was away, sitting with a neighbor whose wife had taken to her bed with child coming late. The house was quiet in a way that no longer felt hollow. Every creak in the floorboards, every breeze through the open window felt lived in. A knock at the door came just after mid-morning. Margaret wiped her hands, expecting perhaps the mail rider or one of the neighboring boys trading eggs for salt. But when she opened it, a woman stood there, tall and weather-worn, with a boy of about 8 clutching her skirts and a canvas bundle at her feet. "Is this the Finch place?" the woman asked, her voice dry and deep. "It is," Margaret said, stepping aside. "Come out of the sun." The woman hesitated, then entered, her boots leaving dry dust on the floorboards. The boy followed, eyes wide as he took in the house. "I'm Edith Langdon," the woman said. "My husband passed this spring. The flood took our cabin and 2 mules. I heard Mr. Finch sometimes takes on hands come harvest." Margaret studied her. There was no pity in Edith's face, only purpose, and the boy's cheeks were sunburnt and freckled, his shirt mended twice at the shoulder. "He's out by the south field," Margaret said. "I'll take you." They walked the length of the pasture together. Edith's silence wasn't cold, only practiced, and when they reached the fence line, Thaddeus straightened from where he'd been fitting a shoe to the roan's hind leg. He wiped his brow and looked from Margaret to the woman beside her. "Thaddeus Finch," he said, offering a hand. "Edith Langdon from Bitterroot Fork." They spoke plainly. Edith had worked wheat and cut timber beside her husband for 12 years. She could muck stalls, mend tack, and had no trouble sleeping in a loft. The boy, Jesse, knew how to handle goats and had a steady hand for feeding chicks. By noon, Thaddeus had settled it. They'd stay in the hay shelter until he could build a second room off the side barn. Edith would help with the late-season cutting and take over care of the sheep through winter. Margaret brought out cornbread and beans, and they ate beneath the cottonwood, Thaddeus quietly carving a new latch for the chicken gate while Jessie watched with open fascination. That night, Margaret lay beside him, her hand resting on his chest. "You didn't hesitate. Didn't see a reason to. They needed a place. We've got one. She reminds me of the women I knew before the fire. All strength and no softness. She'll find softness again," he said. "Same way you did." Margaret didn't answer, but she turned toward him, and he held her until sleep took them both. The weeks passed with rhythm. Edith proved as capable as she claimed, and Jessie took to the chores with a kind of quiet hunger, as though working steadied him. Margaret taught him to patch trousers and how to lift bread without burning the bottom. She kept a close eye but never mothered, sensing the shape of what the boy had lost. One morning, as summer began to falter at the edges, Thaddeus came in with his hat in hand and a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "We got a letter," he said. "From Fort Hall." Margaret looked up from the hearth. "Your brother. Alive. Working a mule train east of the Tetons. Says he's heading toward Montana come fall." She stood slowly. "You'll see him. If he makes it this way, yes." "After all this time?" His eyes were bright. "I never thought I'd hear from him again." Margaret stepped forward and pressed her forehead to his. "Then we'll be ready." "When he's ready." Harvest came early that fall. The days cooled and the air turned sharp in the mornings. Thaddeus built the second room with Jessie holding boards and Edith cutting shingles. Margaret filled jars with dried apples and laid root vegetables in sand-lined crates. On the final day of the season's work, they gathered beneath the grove where Margaret and Thaddeus had spoken their vows. A quilt was spread, and Helen returned from her caretaking with a basket of sweetbread and a ribbon for Jessie's hair, which the boy accepted with an awkward, pleased shrug. Edith sat slightly apart, her face easier now, the tightness behind her eyes eased by the steady work and the safety of a roof that did not leak. Margaret leaned into Thaddeus, their fingers laced between them. "You made room for them," she said. "So did you. I didn't think I had anything left to give." "You didn't have to," he said. "You just had to stay." That night, the air turned colder. Margaret and Thaddeus stood at the window watching frost curl along the edges of the glass. "I was afraid," she said softly, "that my life had ended with the fire. That all that was left would be waiting and remembering." He pulled her close, resting his chin against her hair. "It didn't end," he said. "It changed, and you walked through it. I'm glad I did." They turned from the window and moved through the house as though they had always belonged there. Outside, the sheep settled into their pen, and the hens tucked their heads beneath their wings. The wind carried the scent of dry leaves and chimney smoke. Inside, Thaddeus and Margaret lay side by side, not speaking, not needing to. Their breath was shared, slow and even. Years later, they would tell their grandchildren about that first harvest. About the letter from Fort Benton and the fair with the bear rider no one actually saw. They would speak of Edith and Jessie, who stayed on and built their own small house just past the creek, and of Helen, who baked until her hands gave out and then taught others to do the same. But they would always come back to the quiet of that first winter. The steady work. The small garden beside the kitchen wall. The sound of the wind through the grove where they had spoken their vows. Because that was where it began. In silence, in scars, in resilience. And it never ended. Not really. They lived long and loved longer. And every morning, Margaret woke next to the man who had seen her not as what she had lost, but as who she had become. And that was enough. More than enough. Always.